Hey guys, welcome back. Before we sink into tonight's story, if you're new here, consider tapping that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from tonight. It always means a lot to see where this little corner of the internet reaches. Now go ahead, dim the lights, if you haven't already. Get comfortable. Pull the blanket up. Let your shoulders drop from your ears. Tonight, we're not going anywhere fast. Tonight, we're going back to a world lit by gas lamps and candle stubs, a world of soot-stained chimneys and starched collars, where a woman's dropped glove was scandal enough to whisper about for a week, and where the wallpaper on your bedroom wall might, quite literally, be killing you. This is Victorian England. Not the version you've seen in postcards, all top hats and horse carriages and Christmas carols. The real one. The one underneath, because for all its order, its rules for how to hold a teacup, its rules for who could speak to whom, its rules for grief and courtship and even how long a lady's sleeve should be, Victorian England was, in many ways, quietly, patiently strange. Things we would now consider unthinkable were, back then, simply Tuesday. A green dress dyed with poison. A doctor recommending a tonic laced with something you'd never let near a child today. A portrait taken of someone who had already died, propped gently in a chair. I sometimes painted open afterwards so the photograph would feel more alive. None of it was hidden. None of it was secret. It was just normal. Woven into breakfast, into bedtime, into the small, unremarkable hours of an ordinary week. We're going to walk through it together tonight, slowly. Not to shock you, this isn't that kind of story, but to let you drift through a century that believed itself so civilized, so advanced, so far removed from savagery, while its wallpaper poisoned its children and its doctors prescribed despair in a bottle. There is something strangely soothing about looking back at a world that thought it had everything figured out. We know, now, what they didn't. And there's a quiet comfort in that distance. In watching from here, safe, warm, blankets pulled high, at a world that has already finished happening. So let the modern world fall away for a while. No phones tonight. No deadlines. Just gaslight, and fog, and the particular hush of a London evening before electricity ever touched its streets. Let's start where every Victorian day quietly ended, at nightfall, when the city changed its face, and the rules of daylight gave way to something a little older, and a little stranger. As the last grey light drained from the sky over London, something shifted. The lamplighter came first, moving down the street with his long pole, touching flame to wick, one gas lamp after another blinking awake like tired eyes. Children sometimes followed him for a few houses, just to watch the small ritual of light being coaxed out of darkness, one pool of amber at a time, before their mothers called them inside. The real transformation was already underway. Curtains drawn. Fires banked higher. The parlor, which by day had been a place for correspondence and quiet sewing, became something closer to a stage, because evening, in a respectable Victorian household, was a performance almost as much as it was rest. Dinner ran late, and long. Multiple courses, each announced by a hovering servant, each eaten with the correct fork, in the correct order, while conversation stayed carefully within the bounds of what was proper. Politics, if mentioned at all, was mentioned lightly. Religion was safer ground, though even that had its edges. The real art of a Victorian evening was saying a great deal while revealing almost nothing. Outside those warm, lamplit windows, though, the city told a very different story. London's fog did not simply appear at night, It thickened, curling low between buildings, mixing coal smoke with damp river air until it became something you could taste. Visibility dropped to a few feet in the worst of it. People navigated by memory and by sound, footsteps and cartwheels swallowed and returned strangely by the mist. It was said you could hear someone coming for a full minute before you ever saw their shape emerge, like a figure stepping slowly out of a dream. The poorer streets, unlit and unwashed, belonged to a different rhythm entirely after dark. Costermongers packed away their carts. Doorways became temporary shelter for those with nowhere else. And a peculiar occupation walked the alleys with lanterns held low, the mudlarks and toshas, scavenging the banks and soars of the Thames by night, sifting for anything of value the day had washed away and lost. Meanwhile, in the drawing rooms of the wealthy, oil lamps and candlelight cast everything in that particular flattering gold that Victorian portraiture so loved to capture. Shadows pooled in the corners of rooms deliberately, almost decoratively. Dim lighting wasn't just practical. It was fashionable, believed to be more restful for the eyes, more flattering to the complexion, and beneath all of it, threading quietly through every darkened room and fog-wrapped street, sat details of ordinary life that would unsettle us now completely. The powder on a lady's face, the paper on her walls, the medicine cooling by her bedside. We'll begin there. With beauty. With the small rituals a Victorian woman performed each evening by candlelight, rituals that were, in ways she rarely questioned, quietly working against her. A Victorian woman's evening rarely ended when the dinner plates were cleared. There was still the ritual of the dressing table waiting, a small, private hour before sleep, lit by a single candle or the last warmth of the fire, where the face she had worn all day was quietly undone and, in its own way, remade. Pale skin was the standard of the age. Not merely preferred, but read as a kind of moral shorthand. A woman untouched by outdoor labor, unmarked by sun, was understood to be genteel, protected, worth something. And so pale skin was pursued with real dedication, sometimes with powders made from ground white lead, dusted carefully across cheeks and throat by hand, night after night. Without a second thought, nobody warned her. Nobody could, really. The slow damage that white lead caused crept in quietly, over months and years. Hair thinning at the temples. A grey cast beneath the eyes that no amount of powder could quite hide. Stomach trouble some blamed on rich food, or nerves, or the weather. Rarely, if ever, on the powder itself. There were other rituals too, gentler on the surface. Belladonna drops, squeezed into the eyes before an evening out, to make the pupils dilate, wide, dark, luminous in candlelight. It gave a woman's gaze that dreamy, slightly unfocused quality so admired in portraits of the era. It also blurred her vision for hours afterward. Left her stumbling slightly on staircases she knew perfectly well, though she would never have admitted why. Arsenic found its way into beauty too, in wafer form, sold quietly as a complexion aid, a thin, chalky tablet meant to be eaten, not applied, promising a clear, luminous skin from the inside. Some women swore by it. Some grew increasingly ill and never made the connection, because the illness came on so slowly, so gently, that it felt simply like a change of season, a change of constitution, rather than a change caused by anything they themselves were doing each night before bed. Hair received its own quiet dangers. Dyes made with lead combs, drawn through the hair repeatedly to darken it gradually, left behind a fine residue on the scalp that no one thought twice about. Curling irons, heated directly in the fire's coals, singed more hair than they styled, and the faint burnt smell in a lady's dressing room was simply accepted as the price of fashion. What's striking, looking back, isn't just the danger, it's the calm with which it was absorbed into daily life. No warning labels. No hesitation in the mirror. Just a woman, candle flickering, dabbing powder onto her cheekbones with the same unthinking care she might use to fold a letter, entirely unaware that the very thing making her beautiful tonight was quietly working against her, one evening at a time, and nowhere was that quiet danger more woven into daily life than in the very room she sat in, because the walls around her, in thousands of homes across England, were doing something far worse than her powder ever could. Arsenic, by the middle of the Victorian era, had become almost unremarkable. It sat on chemist shelves beside soap and hair oil, sold without much ceremony, purchased by ordinary people for reasons that had nothing to do with harm. Women bought it as a complexion wafer, as we've just seen. Farmers bought it to control rats. Households bought it, quite openly, as rat poison for the kitchen and the cellar, kept in tins not so differently labeled from flour or sugar, a fact that would occasionally, tragically, end in a case of mistaken identity in a hurried, poorly lit kitchen. But arsenic's real, sprawling presence in Victorian life came through color, a particular shade of green, vivid, brilliant, unlike anything achievable with natural dyes, had become enormously fashionable. It was called Shields green, later refined into Paris green, and it turned up nearly everywhere a Victorian household wanted a splash of vibrancy. Dresses. Artificial flowers pinned to hats. Candles. Toys. Even the icing on celebration cakes, tinted that same brilliant emerald for special occasions, was sometimes achieved with arsenic-laced dye, spooned happily onto a child's slice without a flicker of concern. Wallpaper carried the largest quantities of all. Entire rooms, nurseries, parlors, bedrooms, were papered in that rich, seductive green, sometimes layered thick with pigment for a deeper, more luxurious effect. In damp English homes, where mold grew easily behind wallpaper glued directly to plaster, that arsenic-laden paper could react with moisture and mold to release a faint, invisible vapor into the air of the room. Slowly. Continuously. Especially at night, in closed, poorly ventilated bedrooms, exactly the rooms where families spent the most undisturbed hours of their day. Children, sleeping in green-papered nurseries, sometimes fell mysteriously ill, persistent coughs, stomach pains, a general fading that doctors of the time attributed to almost anything else. Bad air. Weak constitutions. The dampness of the English climate itself, blamed again and again, while the true cause quietly lined the very walls meant to keep them safe and warm. There were warnings, even then. A handful of doctors and chemists raised concerns as early as the 1850s, publishing cautious articles suggesting a connection between green wallpaper and unexplained illness in the household. But arsenic green was beautiful, fashionable, and profitable, and beauty in that era carried a persuasive weight that quiet medical caution rarely matched. Removing the wallpaper meant admitting fault, meant expense, meant undoing a room that guests had admired only last season, so the green stayed on the walls. Families lived inside it for years, raised children inside it, fell asleep inside it, entirely unaware that comfort and danger, in Victorian England, so often shared the very same shade of green, and it wasn't only the walls that quietly betrayed the people trusting them. Down the hall, in cabinets meant to heal rather than harm, something even stranger was waiting. By the time a Victorian family had lived a year or two inside their green-papered rooms, a certain fatigue had settled in, not dramatic, Not sudden, just a slow, persistent tiredness that seemed to belong to everyone in the household equally. It rarely occurred to anyone that a room itself might be the cause. A room was simply a room. Walls did not act. Walls did not do anything at all, as far as anyone understood in the 1850s and 60s. They simply stood there, holding up a roof, holding in warmth, holding a family's life inside their painted borders, and yet, quietly, they were doing something. In one well-documented account from the period, a family in a fashionable London townhouse noticed that their children seemed unusually prone to headaches and stomach upset whenever they spent long hours in the nursery, a room papered. Like so many others, in a deep, glossy arsenic green, chosen specifically because it looked so cheerful, so alive, against the grey London light. When the family travelled and stayed elsewhere for a season, the children's symptoms eased. When they returned home, the symptoms crept back within weeks. No one connected the two events with any real confidence. It read, to them, simply as coincidence, as the unpredictable nature of childhood health. Servants, who spent far longer hours in these rooms than the families they worked for, dusting the walls, tending the fires, sleeping sometimes in smaller rooms papered with the same fashionable green passed down from the main house, often suffered more visibly. Though their complaints were even less likely to be taken seriously. A housemaid's persistent cough was simply a housemaid's persistent cough. Nobody thought to ask what color surrounded her while she slept. Chemists of the era did understand, in a general sense, that arsenic was dangerous when eaten or inhaled directly. What took much longer to accept was the idea that a stable, dry-seeming pigment, glued flat against a wall, could slowly shed something invisible into the air a family breathed each night. It felt, to the Victorian mind, faintly absurd, decoration causing disease. Wallpaper was chosen for taste, for status, for the particular warmth it lent a room in firelight. The notion that it might also be quietly working against the very people it was meant to comfort sat uneasily against everything a well-appointed home was supposed to represent. Even Queen Victoria's own residences were said to contain arsenic green wallpaper in certain rooms. A detail that, however small, captures just how deeply this danger had settled into English life, not confined to the poor, not a mark of neglect, but woven straight through every level of society, palace and townhouse alike. It would take years yet before the connection was widely accepted, before green wallpaper quietly fell from fashion rather than being formally banned. In the meantime, families slept on, beneath walls that glowed softly emerald in candlelight, walls that were, ever so slowly, breathing something back into the room, and the medicine cabinet down the hall held its own version of that same quiet betrayal. Down the hall from the nursery, past the green-papered walls, sat a small cabinet that every respectable Victorian household kept close at hand, not locked, not hidden, simply there, the way a modern home might keep a shelf of aspirin and cold remedies. Inside it, more often than not, sat a substance called calomel. Calomel was mercury, refined into a fine white powder, and it was, for much of the 19th century, one of the most trusted medicines in England. Doctors prescribed it for almost anything. A fever, a stomach complaint, teething troubles in infants, a general sense of sluggishness that a family physician might simply diagnose as bilious, a catch-all term for whatever ailed a patient that week. The remedy, in nearly every case, was the same small dose of grey-white powder, stirred into water or pressed into a child's mouth on a spoon, administered with the same unquestioning confidence a modern parent might use with a fever reducer. It worked, in a sense, that was the cruelty of it. Mercury is a powerful purgative. Patients given calomel would salivate heavily, their bowels would empty, and to a physician trained to see visible bodily response as proof of a remedy's power, this looked very much like healing in progress. The more dramatic the reaction, the more the treatment seemed to be doing its job. Children given repeated doses over weeks for a persistent illness sometimes developed swollen, blackened gums, loosened teeth, a trembling in the hands that never fully left them. Doctors, watching these symptoms appear, occasionally increased the dosage further still, reading the poisoning as a stubborn illness resisting treatment, rather than the treatment itself doing quiet, accumulating harm. Teething powders marketed directly to mothers carried mercury too, sold under gentle, reassuring names, promising to soothe a fretful infant through the discomfort of new teeth. Mothers dosed their babies faithfully, night after night, trusting the little tin exactly as they trusted the doctor down the street, exactly as they trusted the chemist who had recommended it in the first place. There was no reason not to. Everyone used it. It sat on the same shelf as talcum and soap, unremarkable among the ordinary clutter of infant care. Opium had its own quiet place in the same cabinet, sold openly and cheaply as laudanum, a tincture that found its way into remedies for coughs, for restlessness, for the particular exhaustion of new motherhood. A crying infant, unable to settle, was sometimes given a few careful drops to ease it towards sleep, a use so common that certain brands of soothing syrup became household names, trusted implicitly, given without hesitation by mothers who loved their children as fiercely as any mother today. What makes this chapter of Victorian life so quietly unsettling isn't cruelty or neglect. It's the opposite. These were remedies chosen out of care, administered by people doing their genuine best with the knowledge available to them, inside a medical system that had not yet learned to distinguish between a dramatic bodily reaction and true healing. It would take decades of slow, patient observation, doctors comparing notes, families noticing patterns, chemists eventually facing regulation, before calomel and its mercury cousins quietly began disappearing from cabinets across the country, replaced first by hesitation, then eventually by other remedies entirely. But in the meantime, illness in a Victorian household rarely arrived alone. It came instead with an entire private language of cures, some sensible, some strange, some drawn less from medicine than from habit, superstition, and whatever had simply always been done. Long before calomel sat in a cabinet with any official standing, English households had already built an entire quiet architecture of home remedies, passed down not by doctors, but by grandmothers, by neighbors, by whispered advice traded over garden fences on a Tuesday afternoon. A sore throat, in many Victorian homes, was treated with a strip of worn wool sock, still faintly warm from wear, wrapped snugly around the neck before bed. The logic felt sound enough at the time. Warmth soothed, and what could be more warming than something already carrying the body's own heat? Nobody questioned why it needed to be unwashed. That detail, oddly, was considered essential to the cure. Though no one could quite explain why beyond a vague sense that freshness diluted its power, whooping cough, a genuine and frightening illness that claimed many young lives, was met with remedies that ranged from the merely useless to the faintly bizarre. Some families held their coughing child briefly near the mouth of a lime kiln, trusting that the fumes might loosen whatever sat trapped in small lungs. Others swore by a slice of bread and butter, offered by a rider on a piebald horse, a specific, oddly precise superstition that required parents to actually flag down a passing horseman of the correct coloring and ask, with complete sincerity, for his help. Most riders, by all accounts, obliged without much surprise. It was simply understood, in certain villages, as a small kindness one performed for a struggling neighbor. A toothache carried its own small ritual. A tooth pulled from a corpse, worn on a cord around the neck, was believed by some rural families to draw pain away from a living tooth still troubling its owner. The logic sat somewhere between folk medicine and quiet superstition, the two categories blurring so completely by this point in a Victorian household that families rarely bothered separating one from the other. A cure was a cure. Its origin mattered less than its reputation. Warts, stubborn and unsightly, met perhaps the strangest treatments of all. Rubbing a wart with a piece of raw meat, then burying that meat in the garden under a full moon, was believed to transfer the wart into the earth as the meat decayed. Families performed this with genuine seriousness, checking weeks later to see whether the wart had indeed vanished, and often it had, though modern understanding would credit simple, unrelated healing rather than buried meat under moonlight. Fever, one of the most common complaints in any Victorian household, met treatment through what was called sweating out, layer upon layer of heavy blankets piled onto a shivering patient. Windows sealed firmly shut, the room kept deliberately, almost unbearably warm. The reasoning held that illness itself could be forced from the body through perspiration, a belief with roots stretching back centuries, still comfortably intact in 19th century England despite growing scientific understanding elsewhere in medicine. What ties these remedies together isn't foolishness, exactly. It's the particular comfort of ritual in the face of illness that could not yet be properly explained. A family watching a child cough through the night needed something to do with their hands, their fear, their long helpless hours before dawn. A worn sock. A buried piece of meat. A horseman flagged down on a country road. Small, strange acts of care, offered in the dark, by people who loved fiercely and understood far less than they believed they did. An illness, when it did claim a life despite every remedy tried, ushered a Victorian household into an entirely different set of rituals, quieter, more elaborate, and governed by rules so strict that grief itself came to feel like a performance. When death arrived in a Victorian household, it did not arrive quietly into private grief. It arrived into a system, elaborate, exacting, and, for the person mourning, often exhausting in ways that had very little to do with sorrow itself. The clocks in the house were the first to change. Every clock stopped at the moment of death, hands frozen at the exact minute, a small ritual believed to mark the passage respectfully, though it also served a quieter, more practical purpose. A household in mourning needed no reminder of ordinary time continuing to pass around them. Mirrors came next. Every looking glass in the house was covered, draped in black cloth or simply turned to face the wall. Based on an old belief that a soul, newly departed, might become trapped inside a reflection if it caught sight of itself before moving on. Servants performed this task swiftly, methodically, moving room to room within the first hour, long before most of the family had even finished absorbing the loss itself. For a widow, mourning became something closer to a uniform, governed by rules so specific they filled etiquette manuals sold in every respectable stationer's shop. The first year required deep, matte black, no silk, no shine, no ornament of any kind, fabric chosen specifically because it swallowed light rather than reflecting it. Jet jewelry, carved from fossilized wood, was the only acceptable adornment, its own dull black finish considered appropriately solemn. After a year, a widow might progress to second mourning, where small amounts of trim, perhaps a touch of grey or muted mauve, were cautiously permitted. Only after roughly 2 full years could she return, gradually, to ordinary color, and even then, society watched closely, ready to judge a return to lavender or blue as either appropriately restrained or scandalously hasty, depending entirely on the mood of whoever happened to be watching. Men's mourning, by comparison, required far less: a black armband, perhaps a black hatband, worn for a matter of weeks rather than years. The imbalance was rarely questioned at the time, simply another quiet rule among hundreds of others governing a woman's public presentation of grief. Jewelry carried its own strange intimacy. Hair from the deceased was sometimes woven, painstakingly, into brooches or bracelets, fine strands braided into intricate patterns, sealed behind glass, worn against the skin as a small, permanent piece of someone now gone. It was not considered morbid in the least. It was considered tender. A way of keeping something physical, something that had truly belonged to the person. Rather than relying on memory alone, which even then was understood to fade, funeral processions themselves became displays of status as much as grief. The wealthy hired professional mourners, men paid specifically to walk somberly behind the coffin, faces arranged into practiced sorrow, their presence meant to signal the importance of the deceased through sheer number alone. Horses pulling the hearse wore black ostrich plumes, dyed and curled, nodding gently with each slow step through the street, while neighbors paused at their windows to silently note the quality and quantity of flowers, of carriages, of mourners, each detail quietly tallied as evidence of a family's standing. Beneath all this careful performance, though, sat something genuinely human, a society that had not yet found language for grief beyond ritual, that trusted structure to carry a family through loss when words alone felt insufficient. And nowhere was that impulse toward preserving the departed taken further, or stranger, than in a custom involving the camera itself. Photography, in the middle years of the Victorian era, was still a slow and deliberate art, expensive, unhurried, requiring a subject to sit remarkably still for the length of an exposure that could stretch to a full minute or more. For most families, this meant a photograph was a rare event, saved for milestones, for occasions that felt significant enough to justify both the cost and the stillness required. Death, unfortunately, often provided that occasion in a way birth or marriage sometimes could not. Infant mortality ran high across every level of Victorian society, and many families, particularly those without means for elaborate portraits taken in life, found themselves facing a photographer's studio for the very first time only after losing a child. A single photograph, taken carefully in the hours or days following death, often became the only image that family would ever possess of that child's face. Photographers who specialized in this work developed a particular gentleness of technique, born from necessity rather than sentiment alone. A deceased infant might be arranged in a favorite blanket, placed in a crib or cradled in a parent's arms, positioned to look, as closely as possible, simply asleep. For slightly older children, and occasionally adults, more elaborate arrangements were sometimes attempted, a body propped carefully in a chair using a hidden stand or brace concealed beneath clothing, head supported gently. I sometimes painted open afterward directly onto the developed photograph by a skilled retoucher, lending an unsettling, tender illusion of life to an image meant to preserve someone already gone. Family members occasionally posed alongside the deceased, seated close, hands resting gently on a shoulder, expressions composed rather than visibly distressed, the entire scene arranged with the same careful attention a family might give any formal portrait. To modern eyes encountering these photographs now, the effect can feel startling, even unsettling. To the Victorian family commissioning them, the intention was entirely different, not eerie, but deeply tender. A last, careful act of love, performed in the only medium available that could hold a face still forever. These images, once developed, took their place in the parlor alongside photographs of living relatives, displayed openly rather than hidden away. A small oval frame on the mantel. A page in the family album, turned to gently and often, the image of a lost child sitting comfortably among photographs of siblings still very much alive. There was no sense of impropriety in this. Death, in a household that buried children with painful regularity, simply belonged in the same visual record as everything else that made up a family's life. Some photographers grew quietly skilled at this particular, delicate craft, gaining local reputations for their ability to capture a peaceful expression, to pose a small body with genuine dignity, to work quickly and gently in a home still thick with fresh grief. Their studios kept careful, discreet records. And word of a photographer's particular sensitivity in this work passed quietly between grieving families, much the way a good midwife's name might travel through the same community. By the century's final decades, as photography grew faster and more affordable, and as families began accumulating photographs across an entire lifetime rather than reserving the medium for singular occasions, this particular custom slowly faded, not through any sudden shift in feeling, but simply because a child's face no longer needed to wait for death to be captured at all. Grief, in Victorian England, extended its careful attention outward too, not only toward the dead, but toward the youngest of the living, whose daily lives were shaped by rules every bit as exacting as any mourning dress. A Victorian child's day, whether born to wealth or poverty, began early, and rarely with much gentleness. In wealthier households, a nursery maid roused children before dawn, well ahead of their parents' own waking hours. Cold water waited in a basin for washing, drawn hours earlier and left to sit, warmth being considered somewhat indulgent for a young constitution meant to be toughened rather than coddled. A child who flinched at the temperature learned quickly not to show it. Composure, even at 6 years old, was already being quietly instilled as a virtue worth more than comfort. Breakfast for children in these households was deliberately plain: porridge, bread, perhaps a little milk, served separately from whatever the adults enjoyed downstairs. Rich food was considered unsuitable for a developing child, thought to overstimulate rather than nourish, and so nursery meals remained modest regardless of a family's actual wealth. A child raised in one of London's grandest townhouses might eat, most mornings, no differently from a child in a considerably humbler home. Lessons followed almost immediately, often before the household's adults had even finished their own breakfast downstairs. A governess or tutor arrived to the schoolroom promptly, and children sat through hours of recitation, penmanship, scripture, and arithmetic, posture monitored as closely as accuracy. A slouched back or a fidgeting hand could earn a sharp word, sometimes a light rap across the knuckles with a ruler, correction delivered swiftly and without much explanation beyond the assumption that discipline itself built character. Play, when it came at all, arrived in carefully measured portions, often confined to a single hour in the afternoon, and even then supervised closely enough that it rarely felt entirely free. A nursery maid or younger sibling's nurse hovered nearby, ready to intervene at the first sign of a torn dress or raised voice. Quiet, contained games were favored, building blocks stacked carefully, dolls arranged rather than roughly played with, a hoop rolled along a garden path under watchful eyes. For children born into poverty, the day held none of this structure, but considerably more hardship. Many worked from an early age, in factories, in mines, in the streets selling matches or flowers. Hours stretching long before dawn and well past dark. A child of 8 or 9 might already understand exhaustion the way an adult would, shoulders permanently rounded from repetitive labor, hands calloused in ways that would mark them for life. Sleep, when it came, was brief and often shared, several children to a single narrow bed, warmth borrowed from each other's bodies rather than from any fire. Even bedtime, across every class, carried its own quiet formality. Wealthier children said prayers aloud before a nursery maid, memorized and recited with the same precision expected of their daytime lessons, before being tucked beneath thin blankets in rooms often kept deliberately cool. Warmth again considered something to be earned rather than simply given. What unites these very different childhoods, wealthy and poor alike, is a shared conviction running quietly beneath Victorian society, that childhood itself was not a time to be indulged, but a time to be shaped, disciplined, and prepared, as efficiently as possible, for the demanding adult world waiting just beyond it, and that same conviction, that same careful shaping, extended well past the nursery walls, into an entire architecture of household rules that governed nearly every hour. A Victorian family spent beneath one roof. Beyond the nursery, an entire quiet architecture of rules governed a Victorian household, so thoroughly woven into daily life that most family members likely never paused to consider how many small permissions they required simply to exist within their own home. A wife did not typically speak first at dinner, particularly with guests present, waiting instead for her husband or the most senior gentleman at the table to open conversation. Topics themselves carried invisible boundaries. Illness, money, and anything touching on the body were considered unsuitable for the dinner table, leaving conversation to circle politely around weather, travel, and carefully selected literature. Everyone silently understanding which subjects to approach and which to leave entirely untouched. Even furniture carried rules. A piano leg, in certain particularly modest households, might be discreetly covered with a small skirt of fabric, considered too suggestive of a human leg to leave bare in mixed company, a detail that reveals less about pianos themselves and more about just how far Victorian propriety was willing to extend its careful reach into rooms that seemed, on the surface, entirely unremarkable. A young unmarried woman was rarely permitted alone in a room with a man who was not a close relative, even briefly, even innocently. A chaperone, often an older female relative or a trusted servant, remained present for any private conversation, positioned near enough to observe without necessarily overhearing every word. Letters between an unmarried couple, even those on the cusp of engagement, were sometimes read by a watchful mother before being sealed and sent, propriety mattering more, in certain households, than a daughter's private feelings. Servants moved through this architecture according to their own strict, largely invisible code. A housemaid was trained never to be seen carrying certain items through the main rooms of the house, chamber pots, soiled linens. Anything touching on the body's private functions required a separate, hidden route through backstairs and servants' passages, a physical architecture built specifically to keep the unglamorous mechanics of daily life entirely out of a family's sight. A well-run household, by Victorian standards, was one where such labor remained functionally invisible, its evidence never crossing paths with the family it served. Even grief and illness within the family carried their own quiet rules of visibility. A relative suffering from a condition considered embarrassing, whether physical or what we'd now recognize as mental illness, was sometimes kept largely out of sight during visits from outside the household, tucked into a private room upstairs, mentioned only vaguely if mentioned at all, the family's public presentation mattering enough to occasionally outweigh honest acknowledgement of a loved one's suffering. Meals themselves followed precise timing, dictated less by hunger than by an internal household clock everyone understood without needing reminding. Breakfast, luncheon, afternoon tea, dinner, each falling at its expected hour, servants moving through their preparations with quiet, practiced efficiency that made the entire operation appear almost effortless from the family's side of the door. What emerges, looking back at this dense web of small rules, isn't simply rigidity for its own sake. It's a society deeply invested in the idea that order, maintained consistently enough, in small enough details, might hold something larger together entirely, appearances, certainly, but also a genuine, if narrow, sense of safety in a world changing faster than most Victorian families felt entirely comfortable admitting. And nowhere was that invisible architecture of order more thoroughly built than in the relationship between a household and the servants who quietly kept it running. Behind every well-ordered Victorian household, functioning with the smooth, effortless quality that guests so often admired, sat a workforce whose entire purpose was to remain, as much as possible, unseen. A middle-class home might employ just 1 or 2 servants, a general maid handling everything from laundry to cooking to answering the door, her days beginning well before dawn and rarely ending before the family retired for the night. A wealthier household maintained an entire hierarchy instead, each servant occupying a precise rung on a ladder understood by everyone in the house, from the butler overseeing the male staff down to the youngest scullery maid, barely into her teens. Tasked with the household's dirtiest, least visible labor, that scullery maid's day began in near darkness, often as early as 4 in the morning, raking out cold ash from the previous night's fires and laying fresh ones in each room before the family woke to any hint of the labor required to keep them warm. Coal dust settled permanently into the creases of her hands, into the hem of her apron, a quiet physical record of hours the family upstairs would never witness or think to ask about. A lady's maid occupied rather different territory, working closely with her mistress each morning and evening, lacing corsets, arranging hair, managing an extensive wardrobe with an intimacy that blurred, in certain households, into something resembling genuine companionship, even as the fundamental inequality between the 2 women remained absolute and unquestioned. A lady's maid might know her mistress's private worries, her correspondence, her small daily moods, better than almost anyone else in the household, and still be dismissed instantly, without severance or reference, for a single mistake judged serious enough. References, in fact, governed nearly everything about a servant's working life. A dismissal without one could mean genuine ruin, no respectable household willing to hire someone whose previous employer had declined to vouch for their character. This gave employers extraordinary, largely unchecked power over servants who might have worked faithfully for years. A single disagreement or accusation, fair or not, capable of unraveling an entire livelihood within a single afternoon. Servants' quarters themselves reflected this invisible hierarchy in physical form. Male and female staff slept in strictly separated areas, often in the attic or basement, rooms considerably smaller and colder than anything occupied by the family they served. A servant's bell system, wired discreetly through the walls of grander homes, allowed a family to summon help from any room without raising their voice or leaving their seat, each bell corresponding to a specific room, ringing in a designated area below stairs where servants waited, quite literally, for the household above to need them. Meals, too, followed the household's rigid boundaries. Servants ate separately, often after the family had finished, working through courses that had grown cold during service, seated at a long table in the kitchen according to their own internal rank, the housekeeper or butler at its head, much as the family observed rank at their own table above. And yet within this rigid, largely invisible system, genuine relationships did form. A cook who'd served a family for 30 years, present for every birth and death in the household, occupied a strange, lead position somewhere between employee and quiet, unacknowledged family member, her labor essential, her name rarely spoken by the children she'd helped raise once they reached adulthood. Beyond the walls of any single household, though, that same invisible labor extended outward into the city itself, where entire streets moved to rhythms every bit as demanding, and considerably less private. Step beyond any well-run household, servants or otherwise, and Victorian London revealed itself as something considerably less orderly than the parlours and dining rooms tucked behind its front doors. The city had grown faster than almost anyone could properly manage. Within a few decades, London's population swelled into the millions, drawn by factory work, by the promise of wages, by a countryside that increasingly could not support the families still living on it. Housing simply could not keep pace. Entire families crowded into single rooms in the poorer districts, sometimes 2 or 3 families sharing what had once been built to hold one modest household, walls thin enough to carry every cough, every argument, every small sound of a neighbor's life through to the next room. Streets in these districts ran narrow and largely unplanned, built up haphazardly over generations rather than laid out with any real foresight. Waste of every kind, household refuse, the droppings of countless horses pulling carts and carriages through daily traffic, the runoff from nearby tanneries and slaughterhouses, collected in open gutters that ran directly alongside where children played and vendors sold food from open carts. The smell, by every surviving account, was constant, thick enough that visitors from the countryside sometimes described their first encounter with it as physically overwhelming. A wall of odor that Londoners themselves had simply, gradually, stopped noticing. Above it all sat the smog, a thick, yellow-grey haze that settled over the entire city for days at a time during winter months, thick enough to genuinely darken midday into something resembling dusk. Coal fires, burning in nearly every home and factory across the city, released sulphurous smoke that mixed with London's naturally damp river air to create something distinct enough to earn its own nickname, the pea souper, thick and yellow, tasting faintly bitter on the tongue, leaving a fine gritty residue on window sills and washing hung out to dry. Walking through it required a particular kind of navigation, learned rather than taught. Londoners judged distance by sound and memory more than sight during the worst of it. Counting steps between known landmarks, listening for the specific creak of a familiar shop sign swinging overhead. Crossing sweepers, often children, worked the busiest intersections, clearing a narrow path through the accumulated filth for a penny from anyone wishing to cross with clean shoes, their small figures emerging suddenly from the haze like something conjured rather than simply present all along. For the wealthy, smog and overcrowding remained largely a matter of inconvenience, something to be waited out behind closed curtains with the fire built high. Servants sent out only when absolutely necessary. For the poor, packed tightly into districts with the worst ventilation and the least access to clean water. It settled into something closer to a permanent condition of daily life, breathed in and lived with rather than simply endured for an afternoon. Reformers and journalists occasionally wrote of these conditions with genuine alarm, describing streets and dwellings in language meant to shock a comfortable reading public into some kind of action. Change, when it eventually came, arrived slowly. Decades of gradual legislation and infrastructure improvement rather than any single dramatic turning point. In the meantime, the city simply continued, breathing its own thick air, its overcrowded streets carrying within them something far more dangerous than smog and unpleasant smell alone, a vulnerability to disease that would prove, again and again, just how fragile even the grandest Victorian confidence in progress truly was. For all its confidence in progress, in engineering, in the sheer scale of what Victorian ambition had built, London remained, for much of the century, a city where disease moved with a speed and mystery that no amount of self-assurance could hold back. Cholera arrived in devastating waves throughout the middle decades of the century, sweeping through neighborhoods with a suddenness that left doctors genuinely baffled. A person could feel entirely well in the morning and be gone by nightfall, the illness moving through the body with a violence that terrified even physicians who had seen a great deal of death in their careers. For years, the prevailing medical theory held that disease traveled through bad air itself. A miasma rising from filth and decay, drifting invisibly through streets and settling into unsuspecting lungs. Entire public health strategies were built around this belief, streets scrubbed and lime scattered in an effort to purify air that was never, in fact, the true culprit at all. It took a doctor's patient, unglamorous detective work to begin shifting that understanding. During one particularly severe outbreak in Soho, a local physician began meticulously mapping every reported case, marking each death on a simple hand-drawn map of the neighborhood, walking the streets himself to interview grieving families about their daily habits, their food, their water. What emerged from his careful, methodical work was a pattern nobody else had noticed, case after case clustering tightly around a single public water pump, its handle worn smooth from years of daily use by residents who had no reason to suspect the very water sustaining their households might also be quietly killing them. His conclusion, radical for its time, met considerable resistance from a medical establishment deeply invested in the miasma theory. It took the simple, stubborn act of having that pump's handle removed, forcing residents to draw water elsewhere, to demonstrate what data alone had struggled to prove. Cases in the immediate area slowed dramatically. The evidence sat there, undeniable, and yet it would still take years before this understanding of waterborne disease became widely accepted across the broader medical community. Beneath London streets, meanwhile, the very river that had sustained the city for centuries had become something closer to an open sewer. Waste from millions of residents flowed largely untreated into the Thames. The same water sometimes drawn upstream for drinking, the same river whose smell, during one particularly brutal summer, grew so overwhelming that Parliament itself, sitting along its banks, was forced to consider abandoning its own chambers entirely. Curtains soaked in chloride of lime hung uselessly against an odor that no amount of perfume or disinfectant could adequately mask. That summer proved a genuine turning point. Not through medical argument alone, but through simple, undeniable discomfort reaching all the way to the country's most powerful men. Within months, ambitious plans were approved for an entirely new system of underground sewers, a vast engineering effort that would eventually carry London's waste well beyond the city and away from the water its residents depended on daily. Tuberculosis, quieter and slower than cholera but no less devastating, moved constantly through overcrowded housing, through poorly ventilated factories, claiming lives gradually rather than in dramatic sudden waves, so thoroughly woven into the era's normal experience of illness and loss that families sometimes simply expected a certain number of children not to survive to adulthood, slowly, painfully, through outbreaks and engineering projects and a handful of stubborn, careful investigators. Willing to follow evidence rather than assumption, Victorian London began learning the true relationship between filth and illness. That knowledge, hard won, would eventually reshape the city itself. But in the meantime, that same uneasy relationship between appearance and hidden danger extended into something far more personal than public water and city streets, into the very clothing Victorians wore each day. Clothing, in Victorian England, carried meaning far beyond simple covering or warmth. It signaled status, morality, restraint, and femininity so thoroughly that fashion and physical well-being frequently found themselves in direct, quiet conflict, a conflict most Victorians navigated without ever framing it as conflict at all. The corset sat at the center of this tension, worn by women across nearly every social class, though the degree of tightness varied considerably by fashion and personal choice. Boned with whalebone or steel, laced tight enough to shape the torso into the fashionable hourglass silhouette so admired in portraits and fashion plates, a well-fitted corset could compress internal organs measurably, shifting the liver and reshaping the lower ribs over years of consistent wear. Fainting, often attributed delicately to nerves or delicate constitution, was in many documented cases simply the body's response to compressed lungs struggling to draw a full breath. Smelling salts became a fashionable necessity precisely because the fashion itself so reliably produced the need for them. Young girls were introduced to lighter corsets earlier than modern sensibility would find comfortable, their still developing bodies gradually trained toward the expected adult silhouette well before adolescence properly began. Mothers who had worn corsets their entire lives saw nothing unusual in this early introduction. Understanding it simply as necessary preparation, the same way a modern parent might think nothing of orthodontic work begun in childhood for a straighter smile decades later. Crinolines, the wide, cage-like structures worn beneath skirts to achieve the era's fashionable bell shape, introduced their own particular dangers. Made from flexible steel hoops, a crinoline could catch fire with alarming speed if a woman stood too near an open flame, the wide skirt acting almost like a chimney, drawing air and flame upward with terrifying efficiency. Newspaper reports of crinoline fires appeared with grim regularity throughout the fashion's popularity, women's lives lost to a garment that, moments before, had simply seemed elegant and fashionable. The same wide silhouette made doorways and staircases genuinely hazardous, women learning to navigate their own homes with careful, practiced sideways movements that had become so habitual most never consciously thought about them at all. Footwear carried its own quieter damage. Fashionable shoes, narrow and often poorly suited to the actual shape of a woman's foot, gradually reshaped bones over years of wear, bunions and hammer-toes becoming so common among fashionable women that some considered them simply an unavoidable cost of dressing properly, rather than evidence of anything requiring correction. Even men's fashion carried genuine physical cost, though rarely discussed with the same attention given to women's dress. Stiff, high collars, sometimes made from celluloid for a permanently crisp appearance, occasionally restricted circulation enough to cause fainting or, in rare and genuinely documented cases, contributed to a man's death by cutting off blood flow at the neck during a moment of physical strain, a detail that earned these particular collars a grim nickname among those who witnessed such incidents. Hair, too, submitted to fashion's demands. Elaborate styles, built up with padding, false pieces, and heavy pins, sometimes weighed enough to cause genuine headaches by evening, women simply accepting the discomfort as the reasonable price of appearing properly put together in company. What runs beneath all of this, threading through corsets and crinolines and stiff collars alike, is a society that had learned to read physical discomfort itself as a kind of moral discipline, evidence of self-control, of proper upbringing, of a body successfully subordinated to the demands of respectability. Comfort, in this particular framework, was rarely the point. Appearance was, and that same careful management of appearance extended well past the body itself, into an entire, exhausting set of rules about what could be seen, said, and openly acknowledged in polite Victorian company. Beneath the corsets and collars, beneath the careful morning wardrobes and dinner-table silences, sat an entire invisible moral map that every Victorian, however loosely they followed it, carried with them through daily life. Certain words simply could not be spoken in mixed or polite company. Legs, even on furniture, had already earned its careful euphemism in the previous chapter's piano skirts, but the same delicacy extended to the human body itself. A woman did not have legs in polite conversation, she had limbs, the word chosen specifically for its vagueness, its ability to gesture toward the body without ever quite naming it. Pregnancy, similarly, was rarely spoken of directly. A woman was described as in a delicate condition or simply unwell, the actual word considered too indelicate for open conversation, even among women who had themselves experienced it multiple times. Certain topics carried weight far beyond their apparent seriousness. A woman's reputation, once questioned, proved remarkably difficult to restore, regardless of the truth behind whatever rumor had prompted the question. Being seen walking unaccompanied after dark, however innocent the errand, could generate weeks of quiet speculation in a small community. A letter received from an unfamiliar gentleman, even one containing nothing improper, might be enough to damage a young woman's prospects if word of its existence spread through the right drawing rooms. Illegitimacy carried a weight that could follow a child for their entire life, the circumstances of their birth treated as a permanent, defining fact regardless of anything they might later accomplish or become. Families went to considerable lengths to conceal such births when they occurred within their own ranks, sometimes sending a daughter away for several months under the polite fiction of visiting a distant relative, the child that resulted quietly raised as a younger sibling, or given up entirely, the truth known only to a small circle sworn to permanent, careful silence. Divorce remained genuinely rare and deeply scandalous throughout most of the era, available in practice mainly to those with considerable wealth and legal persistence. And even then, a divorced woman carried social consequences that a divorced man rarely faced to the same degree. Many unhappy marriages simply continued for decades rather than risk the social devastation divorce could bring. Couples living quietly separate lives within the same household, maintaining appearances for the sake of children, extended family, and a community that watched closely. And yet, curiously, certain behaviors we might now find genuinely troubling drew far less concern than these matters of propriety and appearance. Corporal punishment of children, servants beaten or verbally abused by employers with little recourse, working conditions in factories that would horrify a modern observer, these existed largely outside the era's careful moral scrutiny, tolerated as simply the ordinary, unremarkable texture of daily life. Rarely discussed with anything close to the intensity reserved for a woman's reputation or a family's public respectability, this selective moral attention reveals something quietly important about Victorian society, that propriety, as practiced, often had less to do with genuine ethical concern than with the careful maintenance of appearances, of hierarchy, of a social order that depended on everyone understanding, and largely accepting, exactly where they stood, beneath this careful architecture of what could and couldn't be spoken aloud, though, ran an entirely different current, one built not on manners or reputation, but on fear, on the small, persistent superstitions that shaped Victorian daily life in ways logic alone could never quite dislodge. For all its faith in progress, in engineering and empire and scientific advancement, Victorian England remained, in its quieter corners, a genuinely superstitious world, one where careful rational explanation and old, half-remembered folk belief sat comfortably side by side, rarely questioned by the very people practicing both at once. A single magpie, spotted alone on a garden wall or fence post, could unsettle an entire household's mourning. The old rhyme counting magpies for luck, sorrow, and secrets was recited half-jokingly by most, and yet a surprising number of otherwise sensible Victorians would still glance around anxiously for a second bird, some quiet superstitious reflex refusing to be entirely reasoned away. Even by those who considered themselves thoroughly modern in every other respect, mirrors carried danger well beyond mourning rituals. Breaking one meant 7 years of misfortune, a belief so deeply embedded that servants handled looking-glasses with genuine care, and a cracked mirror discovered in a household was sometimes quietly replaced before anyone else noticed, sparing the family from having to discuss the misfortune it supposedly promised. New Year's Day carried its own careful ritual, a household's first visitor of the year needing to be a dark-haired man for the year ahead to bring good fortune, families sometimes arranging quietly for a suitable neighbor to knock precisely at midnight. Ensuring luck arrived exactly as tradition demanded rather than leaving something so important to chance. Weddings carried an entire private language of omens, some still recognizable today. A bride seeing her own reflection fully dressed before the ceremony was thought to invite bad luck, and so many brides left a single glove unworn or a hairpin not yet placed until after the ceremony had properly begun, a small deliberate incompleteness meant to satisfy an old belief without anyone needing to discuss it openly. Rain on a wedding day, rather than universally dreaded, was considered by some families a sign of fertility and blessing, a reminder that even within superstition, interpretation varied considerably from household to household, region to region. Death carried perhaps the heaviest weight of superstitious care. A body was traditionally carried from a house feet first, ensuring the departed could not glance back and beckon another family member to follow. Bees, kept by many rural households, required their own careful ritual upon a death in the family. Someone had to walk to the hive and quietly inform the bees of what had happened, draping the hive in black cloth much like a mirror, out of genuine concern that failing to do so might cause the entire colony to die or simply abandon the property in apparent grief or protest. Salt spilled at the table demanded an immediate small correction. A pinch thrown over the left shoulder to ward off whatever ill luck the spill had summoned, a gesture performed almost reflexively by servants and family members alike. Rarely acknowledged aloud, simply woven into the automatic choreography of dining, even illness carried its superstitious edges alongside the strange cures explored earlier. Certain families believed passing a sick child through a cleft in a living tree, then binding the tree closed again afterward, could transfer illness away from the child and into the healing wood itself, the tree's own recovery symbolically carrying the child's affliction with it. What makes these beliefs so quietly fascinating isn't their strangeness alone, but how comfortably they coexisted alongside genuine scientific achievement, a society capable of mapping cholera outbreaks with careful empirical precision, and yet equally capable of throwing salt over a shoulder without a second thought, two entirely different ways of understanding an uncertain world, held simultaneously, without much apparent contradiction felt by anyone practicing both, beyond these quiet, private rituals, though. Victorian England found its uncertainty a different outlet entirely, in entertainment built specifically around the strange, the theatrical, and occasionally the genuinely macabre. When Victorians sought entertainment, they found it in forms that reflected the same complicated relationship with death, spectacle, and human suffering that had already threaded quietly through so much of their daily life. Public executions, for much of the century, remained genuinely public, drawing crowds numbering in the thousands who gathered outside prison walls well before dawn, securing good vantage points, sharing food and drink with the easy familiarity of neighbors at a fair rather than witnesses to a death. Vendors moved through the crowd selling pies, ballads printed hastily with details of the condemned's crime, small souvenirs commemorating the occasion. Families brought children along. The event considered not shocking but instructive, a visible demonstration of consequence meant to reinforce, quite literally, the cost of crime. Only in the century's later decades did executions move behind prison walls, private rather than public, a shift that reflected changing sensibilities more than any sudden change in the punishment itself. Freak shows and human exhibitions, uncomfortable as the concept sits with modern audiences, drew steady crowds throughout the era. Individuals with visible physical differences displayed for paying audiences under carefully constructed stage names and invented backstories, they're genuine. Humanity often obscured entirely behind whatever narrative proved most commercially compelling. Some performers found in this arrangement a degree of financial independence otherwise unavailable to them, a complicated truth that sits uneasily alongside the genuine exploitation such exhibitions frequently involved. Waxwork exhibitions, most famously the traveling and later permanent displays associated with one enterprising Frenchwoman's collection, drew crowds eager to view remarkably lifelike figures of murderers, monarchs, and notorious criminals alike, displayed together with little distinction, visitors moving quietly between a beloved royal figure and a recently executed killer with the same casual curiosity. A separate, dimly lit chamber often housed the most gruesome exhibits, deliberately partitioned from the main collection, allowing visitors who wished to avoid the darker material an easy path around it, while those seeking exactly that particular thrill knew precisely where to find it. Theatre itself embraced spectacle and melodrama with an enthusiasm modern audiences might find almost exhausting. Villains booed loudly and openly by audience members fully invested in the performance. Heroes cheered with equal, unrestrained enthusiasm. Sensational stage adaptations of real, recent crimes appeared with startling speed after an actual event, sometimes within mere weeks of a genuine murder trial concluding, audiences eager to see a dramatized version of a story they'd only recently read about in the newspaper. Seances, meanwhile, gained enormous popularity across every social class during the century's middle and later decades. Mediums claiming to communicate with the recently departed drawing genuinely grieving families into darkened parlors. Tables tipping and knocking through means later revealed, in many documented cases, to be entirely mechanical trickery. And yet belief persisted stubbornly even after exposure, grief proving considerably more powerful than skepticism for families desperate for any remaining connection to a lost child or spouse. Even something as ordinary as a family stroll through certain public gardens carried its own quiet theatrical quality. Elaborate fireworks displays and staged reenactments of famous battles drawing crowds eager for spectacle delivered safely, at a comfortable distance. Entertainment and genuine danger kept carefully, deliberately separate. What ties all of this together, curiously, is a society drawn again and again toward death and darkness as entertainment, even while maintaining, in nearly every other context, such careful, exhausting rules about what could be acknowledged in polite company. Perhaps it was precisely because so much remained unspoken in daily conversation that Victorians sought, in their entertainment, permission to look directly at what they otherwise so carefully avoided naming. Beneath even this appetite for spectacle, though, ran something quieter and more universal, a genuine, largely unspoken uncertainty about a world changing faster than anyone quite knew how to manage. Beneath every rule, every ritual, every carefully maintained appearance explored so far, ran a current of genuine, largely unspoken anxiety, the quiet understanding that the world Victorians had so carefully built was changing faster than any single generation could comfortably absorb. Industrialization had transformed England within a single lifetime almost beyond recognition. men and women who had grown up in a countryside governed by seasons and church bells now lived, many of them, within city rhythms dictated by factory whistles and railway timetables, an entirely new relationship with time itself settling over the country with remarkable speed. Older Victorians sometimes spoke, in letters and diaries that survive today, of a genuine disorientation at how thoroughly their world had shifted, familiar landmarks of their childhood replaced by railway lines and factory chimneys within the span of a few short decades. Class itself felt less stable than it once had, however rigid its outward rules remained. New industrial wealth created families with genuine fortune but no inherited social standing, occupying an uncomfortable, ambiguous position that unsettled an older aristocracy accustomed to a more predictable ordering of society. Etiquette manuals proliferated during this period partly in response to this very anxiety, offering increasingly detailed guidance to newly wealthy families desperate to navigate social waters that had once seemed, to those born into old money, simply intuitive. Scientific discovery, for all its genuine progress, brought its own quiet unease alongside every advancement. Ideas about human origins and the natural world, emerging from careful scientific study during this period, challenged religious understanding that had structured English life and morality for centuries, leaving many Victorians caught uncomfortably between genuine intellectual curiosity and a deep, sincere fear of what might be lost if older certainties gave way entirely. Death itself, so carefully ritualized throughout this story, carried an urgency beneath its elaborate mourning customs that spoke to genuine, constant proximity. Infant mortality remained high enough that few families reached adulthood without losing at least one child along the way. Disease could arrive suddenly, as we've seen, taking a person from apparent health to death within days. This constant nearness to loss shaped an entire culture's relationship with grief, with religion, with the careful preservation of memory through photography and hair jewelry and stopped clocks, all of it, in its way, a response to genuine, well-founded fear rather than mere decorative custom. Women, too, navigated a particular quiet anxiety of their own, caught between an idealized domestic role that Victorian culture celebrated endlessly in art and literature, and a growing, still largely unspoken awareness among many educated women that this role felt increasingly narrow, increasingly insufficient against their own genuine capabilities and desires. Early conversations about women's education, about legal rights within marriage, about the possibility of a life beyond the domestic sphere entirely, moved quietly through certain circles throughout the era, a genuine undercurrent building slowly beneath the centuries' more visible, more celebrated ideals of feminine domesticity. And beneath everything else sat empire itself, vast and, to most Victorians, a source of genuine pride and identity, yet carrying its own quiet contradictions that occasionally surfaced even in polite conversation, a nation that prized order and moral rectitude at home while its expanding reach abroad raised questions few were entirely comfortable examining too closely. What emerges, looking back at this quiet undercurrent of anxiety running beneath so much visible confidence, is a society working very hard, through ritual and rule and careful appearance, to feel more certain than it genuinely was. The corsets and calling cards, the mourning customs and dinner table silences, all of it served, in some quiet way, as a kind of collective reassurance against a world that had already begun, in ways most Victorians could sense but rarely name outright, to slip beyond anyone's full understanding or control, and it's in that quiet, human uncertainty, rather than in any of the era's stranger customs, that Victorian England perhaps feels most understandable to us now, however distant its gaslit streets and starched collars might otherwise seem. And so, as the fog settles once more over those quiet London streets, and the last gas lamp flickers low toward morning, we come to the end of tonight's walk through Victorian England. It's strange, when you sit with it a while, how much of what we've wandered through tonight felt, to the people living it, entirely unremarkable. The green wallpaper glowing softly on a nursery wall. The spoonful of grey powder offered in genuine care. The corset laced a little tighter each morning, the mirror draped without question after a death, the salt thrown quietly over a shoulder without anyone quite remembering why. None of it felt strange to them. It simply felt like Tuesday, like breakfast, like the ordinary shape of a life being lived as carefully and as lovingly as anyone knows how, with whatever understanding happened to be available at the time. That's perhaps the quiet lesson tucked inside all of it. Every era, including our own, carries its own version of that same unknowing, habits and comforts we hold today, certain and unquestioned, that some future evening, some future listener drifting toward sleep, might find just as curious as we've found the arsenic wafers and mourning veils of a century now safely behind us. There's something almost tender in that thought, rather than unsettling. We are all, always, doing our best with what we currently understand, so let the gaslight fade now. Let the fog roll back off these old streets, and let Victorian England settle quietly back into the past where it belongs, its rules and rituals folded away like an old photograph placed gently back into its album. You've made it to the end of tonight's story. Wherever you are, however heavy your eyes have grown by now, I hope this journey gave you exactly what you came here for, a slow, gentle drift away from today, and toward whatever rest is waiting for you now. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If your eyes are already closed, that's exactly where they should be. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time, for another quiet walk through the past.